Here's an idiom you're probably familiar with, to butter someone up. But have you ever wondered where that phrase comes from? Why people started saying it in the first place? Well, what if I told you that as far back as 1600 BCE, the people of modern-day India would sometimes throw balls of butter at statues of the gods in order to win their favor? And when the British learned the practice during occupation, they thought it was a fitting metaphor for what we might call flattery, buttering someone up. An idiom was born. Today, we'll look at 12 English phrases with some truly unbelievable origins, from medieval scammers to blind pilots to grave-digging doctors. The history behind some of our everyday language might just knock your socks off. If someone has a few skeletons in their closet, it means they've probably got some secrets they'd rather keep to themselves. And frankly, this idiom has a rather grisly past of its own. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1800s, and medical students in the UK have a big problem. They can't find enough human bodies to dissect and study, because prior to 1832, the only corpses that were legally permissible belonged to convicted and deceased murderers, which luckily there weren't too many of. And so a shadowy market begins to develop for dead bodies. Groups of bandits raid graveyards to dig up and sell recently buried individuals. And who are the buyers? Med students. And where do they stash the goods? Well, let's just say they may have had some skeletons in their closets. We've got medieval fraudsters to thank for the phrase, to let the cat out of the bag. And what scheme were these dastardly cons carrying out? Well, in the Middle Ages, it was common practice to sell livestock like pigs, chicken, and ducks in cloth sacks. But unscrupulous dealers would sometimes hide a less valuable animal in a sack, like a cat, and then try to pass it off as something more expensive, like a pig. But as you might imagine, this ruse was hardly airtight, and on occasion a curious feline would emerge from the sack before the deal was done, exposing the deception. In that moment, the cat would quite literally be out of the bag. What does it mean to steal someone's thunder? Well, a simple definition might be to upstage someone or to pull attention from them. And that feeling was probably familiar to playwright John Dennis in the year 1709. Dennis had just mounted a production of his new play, Appius in Virginia, in London. The show was a total flop, but it did feature a bit of innovative theater tech that Dennis himself had invented, a machine that made the sound of thunder. And it was apparently quite effective, because shortly after Dennis's show closed, a rival production got hold of the device and used it for their own staging of Shakespeare's Macbeth. When Dennis realized that his invention had been poached, he was understandably ticked off and reportedly exclaimed, "They will not let my show run, yet they steal my thunder." His words have been with us ever since. To turn a blind eye to something is to purposefully ignore it. And that's exactly what famed Admiral Horatio Nelson did during the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801. Nelson was leading part of the British fleet against the combined forces of the Danish and Norwegian navies. At the height of the battle, Nelson wanted to press the attack. So when his superior, Admiral Hyde Parker, signaled from a nearby boat that he should in fact retreat, Nelson, who was partially blind, raised a telescope to his sightless eye and claimed that he saw nothing. After the British won the day, Admiral Hyde was recalled to England in disgrace, and Nelson became Commander-in-Chief of the British Navy. If someone gets your goat, they're annoying you quite a bit, and this rather bizarre turn of phrase actually comes from the world of horse racing. In the early 1900s, trainers sometimes kept live goats alongside their racehorses before a big competition. Apparently, the goat's presence helped the horses stay calm amidst all the excitement. But rival trainers looking for an edge would occasionally kidnap their competitors' goats in the hopes of throwing off a horse's composure. A dirty move, to be sure, and for those on the receiving end of such a prank, it was no doubt annoying in the extreme. A white elephant refers to something that costs a lot of money and is more or less useless. I'm sure you could think of examples. But what's the backstory here? Well, it starts in the kingdom of Siam, known today as Thailand. For much of antiquity, white elephants, which account for around 1 in every 10,000 births, were considered to be sacred in the region. And the king would on occasion gift one of these prized white elephants to his various courtiers. But there was a catch. If the king liked the courtier, he would include a parcel of land in the gift, seeing his elephants need a fair amount of space and food to thrive. But if the king didn't like the courtier, they'd get the sacred elephant with no land, meaning they had to foot the bill for housing and feeding it on their own. And you thought owning a dog was expensive. At some point, you've probably had to get something done before a certain deadline. No big deal, right? It's just a due date. At least it is now. When the term was created during the American Civil War, it had a much more sinister connotation. In that era, a deadline referred to the border around a prisoner of war camp. The camps didn't have much in the way of walls or fences, so POWs were given a blunt warning. Anyone who crossed the border would be shot instantly. In the decades that followed, newspaper publishers began using the term to refer to the area outside the printable page, where text would simply be cut off. And in the early 20th century, journalists eventually gave deadline the time-sensitive meaning that it still has today. To do something by the seat of your pants is to do it by instinct or intuition, without planning things out. And this phrase comes to us from the early days of aviation. At the time, cockpit instruments were quite rudimentary, and if a pilot flew into cloud cover, he or she would need to rely on the feeling of their body in the seat to determine the orientation of the aircraft. Pressure from below meant that the nose of the plane was rising, and a feeling of lightness signaled the start of a dive. Over time, experienced pilots grew attuned to a range of physical sensations that helped them fly blind safely, or fly by the seat of their pants. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth. In other words, don't look for faults in something that's been given freely. Good advice, but what's the big problem with looking at a horse's mouth? To answer that question, let's turn to St. Jerome, who first offered this advice in one of his biblical commentaries around 400 CE. At the time, the most convenient way to figure out a horse's age was to look at the size and shape of their teeth, because, unlike humans, horses' teeth never stop growing. To look at a gift horse's mouth, then, was a way to gauge the value of the offering, a bit like checking for a price tag on Christmas morning. Rude. Oh, and those growing horse teeth? They're responsible for another idiom you might know: to be long in the tooth, aka to be older. When someone bites the bullet, they're doing something unpleasant yet necessary. But the true history of this idiom is anything but metaphorical. In the late 18th century, battlefield surgeries were crude, messy, and above all, painful. Surgeons couldn't yet take advantage of anesthesia or morphine, so they worked with what they had on hand: bullets, and lots of them. And during amputations or extractions, they directed soldiers to literally bite down on their metal ammunition to distract from the pain. Ow. Someone who plays devil's advocate pokes holes in an argument or a point of view. But did you know that the devil's advocate is a real person? Or at least it was. In the year 1587, Pope Sixtus V founded the office of the Advocatus Diaboli, Latin for devil's advocate. And this individual was given a very specific task: to argue against the canonization of potential new saints. In other words, when the church was considering whether to anoint a new saint, the devil's advocate would come up with as many reasons as possible that that person did not qualify: indiscretions in their youth, lapses in piety, any dirt that would hurt their case. And while the office of devil's advocate is officially gone today, the Catholic Church still has a similar practice. In 2003, during the beatification hearings for Mother Teresa, the Church invited famed atheist Christopher Hitchens to argue against her becoming a saint, although in the end, Mother Teresa prevailed. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and let me know. Your feedback is very useful. And don't forget that you can learn about even more idioms on my Hero page. Here's that link. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, keep reading, keep learning, and be well.